Hi everyone, this is Cyril. You're welcome to Cloud Journey HQ, and today's video is going to be more like comparison between the Microsoft Azure storage account and the AWS S3 bucket. This video is going to be in two parts. So the first session is going to be handled by my colleague Kosiso Akaize, and she's one amazing AWS community builder that has been in the container space and also in the Kubernetes space and even automation space. So I feel she's actually one nice person to also chime in on how this resource works in AWS. She's going to be starting up with this session while I'm going to sharing my own part, which is going to be how to implement the Microsoft Azure storage accounts and how to access the blobs in the storage account. Mind you, what storage account does basically is just to keep blob data. So when I mean blob, I mean binary large objects. So in AWS, it's called the blob objects. In Microsoft, it's called the blob files. So these are actually how the storage account in the cloud tends to keep unstructured data. So when I mean unstructured data, so I mean exe files, the pictures, the videos, just files that are unstructured, right? More like you have a pile of papers without sorting them that this is for math, this is for English. So these are unstructured data you keep in the cloud. So without further ado, I'm going to dive right into the session for today. Why Techie Coco gives us a rundown of how this blob storage can be used to upload data and also access data all from the internet. Thank you, and please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And I'll be sharing my own session of this video going forward. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Akeze Kosisochukwu, and today I will be taking you through on how to create an Amazon S3 bucket, as well as the permissions S3 bucket offers. So when I talk about permissions, I'm referring to the access control list and the bucket policy. I'll be explaining the difference between the two, when you should use them, and why you should use them. So without taking much of your time, I will be getting right into it. So the first thing is to get to this portal. I already signed in, and then I typed S3 here, and then clicking on this brought me to this particular view. Another thing I also want to talk about is the region. So if you don't want to, for this test, I'm currently on US East 1, but then you could change regions, and regard any region you pick here, it shows you a portal, like something similar to this, that you could also get started in. So you can pick any of the regions you want, but for this practice, we are going with US East 1. So yeah, so the next thing is to click on this button, create bucket, and okay, so let's start the configuration. By default, you have the general purpose. We'll leave it as that because we're not going to be picking this one. And then another thing is to pick a bucket name. So most times I like playing around with this field, this text field, just so that it sticks. But then if you don't want to waste so much time, you could click on series for bucket naming to be able to see the different acceptable bucket names you could use. So for this, I will name mine something unique, Turkey Cocoa AWS buckets. Let's see if this works. Then also another thing is the object ownership. So when I say object, that's a difference. Let me explain what a bucket and what an object, what it means. Then I'll get into the ACLs. So bucket is like a storage container, which is what we are creating now, right? So see it as a storage container in the cloud. Anything you put inside that bucket is referred to as objects. It could be files, it could be folders, it could be images, it could be videos. Anything that go inside the bucket is referred to as objects. So now let's talk about the permission. So we have the access control list and the bucket policy. So the access control list is within the buckets. So this permission is within the is within the objects. So the access control list, when you enable access control list, it means that you are enabling permission object by object. It's on the object level. But then for bucket policy, you are enabling permission on the bucket level, right? So what do I mean by that? I already explained that anything you put inside a bucket is known as object. So let's say, for example, that you want to make, maybe you have an object, maybe you have a bucket, and then you have like 5 images inside that bucket, right? And then you want maybe two of those images to be publicly accessible over the internet, and then you want the other three not to be accessible. So by default it's not publicly accessible, but then you want to make two publicly accessible. You can enable access control list on those buckets, on that bucket. And when you enable access control list, you have options of setting permissions on that object. So you could go to the objects you want to make publicly accessible, click on, you can check the read access, or you can also check the read and write access. So you have permissions to set it per object. But then if you want to save yourself the stress, let's say in a particular bucket you have about 100 objects inside that bucket, and you want to make those 100 objects to be publicly accessible, you wouldn't want to come and be doing it one by one. So an easier way is to set a bucket policy. So bucket policy, if for example you set a bucket policy that allow public access to your object, it means that every object within that bucket becomes publicly accessible. So it's easier to control, and then it has better security features, and it's a recommended approach that AWS offers. So that's one of the recommended approach. So you can see that by default, access control list is disabled. But then we're also going to create another bucket where we enable it so that you will see the difference between the two. So for this bucket, we're going to still disable it because I want to use this bucket and set the bucket policy permission. So let's continue. The next thing is this. So yeah, Amazon has AWS has, for each of their services, it has various security features put into place. This is one of them. Even if I uncheck this and uncheck it, meaning that people can view my bucket and all the objects inside that bucket, that doesn't necessarily mean that people have access to it. This is just one layer of the security. So even if I check this, people cannot still see my objects publicly. They cannot still see, it's not public, they can't still see it. So yes, but it's one of the stages. So I unchecked, and then AWS, they give me this warning. And yes, I know what I'm doing. I acknowledge that the current settings, my result, exactly, I know what I'm doing. So yeah, you check it. This is just a warning for you to know, oh yeah, are you sure you want to do this? So that's just a warning. And then the next thing is bucket versioning, right? So I see versioning as a Git commit history. You could reference back to the previous commits, and and so on and so forth. So bucket versioning allows you to recover from unintended user actions. It could be a delete process, it could be a modification process, like editing. It could be even application failure. So it allows you to go back to the previous version of what your bucket was, right? So even if you accidentally lose your bucket, you still have a version stored. But for this practice, we don't necessarily need it because we're deleting it once we're done. So we'll disable it. And then tags. Tags helps you to organize your resources. So for example, if it says here you can use bucket tags to track storage costs and organize buckets. Exactly. So when you create resources on AWS and maybe you want to delete them or maybe you want to track them, tags is a typical feature to help you do that. But we don't need tag, we're just deleting it. It's not like we're keeping this bucket. So I think we're done. Every other thing should be left as default. So now let's create our bucket. It takes a bit of time. Perfect. So we've successfully created the bucket, Techie Coco AWS bucket. That's the name of our bucket. And now that we have this bucket, we're going to upload files inside this bucket. So we click on this button, upload, and we're going to add files. Do I have any image? Okay, I think I have. So yeah, I just uploaded one image. So we'll leave every other thing the way it is, and then we click on upload. Okay, perfect. It's done uploading. So let's just check if we can view this. Mind you, we just unchecked that block public access. We didn't do any other thing. We didn't set access control list. We didn't set bucket policy. So it's just like that. So let's know if we can actually view this using the URL link provided. So this is a URL. I'm going to copy it and I'll paste it here. So see, access denied. You don't have access to it. So let's get to the permission. For this bucket, I'm going to be using bucket policy for this one. A bucket policy is usually done on the bucket level. So let's create a bucket policy. Okay, so we'll go to the permissions tab and see the bucket policy. We're going to click on the edit. So bucket policies is a JSON is in JSON format. Yes. So we're going to put it in. I'll put it in first, and then once I'm done putting it in, I will explain what every of the key slash the value what they do. So the first thing is to put in version, which version you'll be using. That's the first key. For this case, we'll be using the 2012 10 17. So that's the version we'll be using. Next thing is to put in the statement key. Inside the statement, we're going to put in the permissions. So this is an array of objects. Okay, and within that we have the effect key, and we're going to set it to allow. Then the next thing is the principal. That's the next key. You could always find this online, right? You don't really need to like know it off heart, or cram it or whatever. You can always get it online. The major thing is for you to be able to understand what you want and what the policy is actually stating or actually allowing. So we'll put the wildcard here because we want every person to have access to this, every person over the internet to have access to this. And then we have the action. So what action do you want people to actually do here within this bucket? So we're putting the SWGET object operation. Okay. The next thing is to put the resource. That's the next thing. And the next thing, that's you put in this bucket. So which resource are we actually referring to? Then I'll put a wildcard. So yes, we are done, and I will explain what each of these keys. So generally what this JSON does is that it allows public read access to all the objects inside the Techie Coco AWS bucket. So it allows every object here automatically is publicly accessible. So that's it. So yeah, let me explain more on each of them. So we have the version, the AWS policy version format. We picked 2012 10 17. And then we have the statements. One of them is the effect, and we put allow. You could put in deny, but then we're using allow because we want to grant permission instead of denying it. And then you have the principal. The principal means who actually have access to this. So it could be an AWS account, it could be an IAM user, it could be anything. But for now, we're putting the wildcard because we want everybody to access it. So that's why we put this wildcard. And then we have the action. The action is like, what is the operation that you want people to have access to in this bucket? And we're putting in the S3 get object. So this operation allows users to read and download objects from this S3 bucket. And then we also reference the particular bucket we are referring to. That is the essence of this resource. So let's know if this works. Let's check. I'm trying to get down. Ooh, this is taking so much. Okay, so we'll click on save changes. Perfect. So we've already modified the bucket policy. So let's go back and check if our buckets, if our objects, it can be publicly accessible now. So Let's see. So we copy this object URL, paste it here, and yay, we can view it based off of the bucket policy that we've set. So to try another one, we're going to be uploading another object within this bucket. And remember, I told you that once you set a bucket policy, for example, if you make it public, any configuration you set on the bucket policy will be applied across every object within that bucket. So now that we've set public read access on this bucket, let's try uploading another object and see if it's going to automatically take up the configuration of the bucket it's in. So let's go back to the bucket. Let's upload another one. Do I have images here? Okay, let me upload this one. Click on upload. And yes, it's done uploading. So let's check if we can see it. Copy the URL, paste it, and voila, we can see it. So this explains what bucket policy does and how it reflects. So now let's move back. Now that we've explained bucket policy using this bucket, we're going to be creating another bucket entirely, and that bucket we're going to be using that to explain the access control list. So without wasting much time, let's get started. So we come here, create buckets, and let me call it Turkey Cocoa Buckets ACL. I think this name is unique. And we will enable access control list this time. So AWS gives you warning, and then we will create buckets. Okay, so we've successfully created that bucket. So we're going to upload objects inside that bucket. So we'll be uploading like 2 files. Maybe one. Okay, let me upload this one. Okay, let's make it 2. So we've uploaded, click on upload. And yes, we've succeeded in uploading these 2. So let's set the access control list. So by default, regardless of you setting the access control list, either enabling it or disabling it, by default, your object is not publicly accessible by default. So now we want to make this one. Let's just check if we can view this object, but I'm sure we won't. Exactly, we won't be able to see it because that's the default. The default means you can view it. So now, because we've enabled access control list, we'll get to the permission of that particular object and we can edit. And yes, AWS is trying to be very cautious, so we can let me check to refresh. Oh, public access is blocked. Oh, we turned on. Okay. Yeah, no, I want it off. We forgot. Yeah, okay, perfect. So we can go back to the objects. And this is the one we want to make public. So we get to the permissions, access control list, and yes. And AWS is really security conscious because they didn't even allow write access. Because write means you can modify, you can edit, you can delete, and we don't want that. So they're just taking precautions. So for here, we can click on read. Read means, everybody can view this and also download this object. And then they put up this warning for you to know what you're doing. And yes, we know what we're doing, so we'll check it. And we save changes. And now that we've saved changes, let's check if we can view it now. So you come here, type in the URL, and yes, it's visible. So this explains the access control list and the bucket policy, and you can see now the difference when to use them. So in scenarios, some people will say, but AWS doesn't recommend access control list, but why? I mean, you can use it in very simple cases and in not so complicated situations. But it's advisable to make use of bucket policy, right? Because it's more scalable, more has more security features, and you can always track whatever you've done. So I gave a scenario of when you have 100 buckets and you want to make them accessible. Will you use an access control list to do that? No, that will take a whole lot of time. Rather, you set a bucket policy to enable read access on all the objects within that bucket. So thank you guys. I hope you do understand and you do follow up with um, what I've explained. And if you have any questions, please do leave it on the comment section. But before we go, never forget to delete all the resources that you've used. So first of all, we're going to empty these buckets. Um, no, we're going to empty the buckets because if you don't empty the buckets, you can't delete the buckets. So we empty this one. Perfect. And then we will empty the next one. Okay. So now we can delete this bucket. We don't want to. Deleting this saves you from potential billing. So you need to be very mindful of deleting every resource you are not using to avoid incurring costs. So we'll also delete this one. Click on copy and paste everything. Perfect. So yeah, we're done, and it brings us back to the portal where we started. So thank you guys once again. See you